The houses here are spaced for privacy, and for years, nothing had ever happened that would justify a headline. Daniel Reeves was a 34-year-old software engineer who lived a life of rigid, self-imposed structure. Working from home and ordering his groceries online, he spent his nights in a house at the end of Cedar Lane, adhering to a routine that left no room for the unexpected. Daniel's personality made him a reliable observer. He was logical, skeptical of anything supernatural, and lived a solitary existence. If his environment changed, he was the kind of person who would look for a mechanical or technical explanation before considering anything else. His two-story house was a secure, predictable environment. The layout was standard, with a front door secured by a heavy deadbolt, the primary boundary between Daniel's ordered life and the world outside. Because Daniel lived with such forensic precision, any disruption to his routine was statistically significant. His life was a controlled environment, meaning any deviation had to be an external intrusion. The first anomaly was temporal. At exactly 2:14 a.m., Daniel woke to a subtle dragging noise coming from the first floor. It wasn't the sound of the house settling. It was the acoustic signature of something heavy being moved slowly across the floorboards. Daniel investigated the living room to find everything exactly where it should be. However, as he turned to head back upstairs, he noticed the front door was open by an inch, allowing a draft of cold November air into the hallway. He spent the morning convincing himself he had simply forgotten to turn the lock before bed. He relied on the logical assumption of human error, even though he knew his nightly security check was a habit he never skipped. This wasn't a forced entry. No locks were broken and no alarms were triggered. Something had simply slipped past the physical and logical defenses of the house without leaving a trace. The pattern repeated every night. At 2:14 a.m., the dragging sound returned, slow and deliberate. The timestamp never varied, turning the phenomenon into a nightly countdown. New variables emerged in the following days. Daniel began recording the audio on his phone, and while the playbacks were mostly silent, he eventually found a voice buried under layers of static, repeating a distorted, unintelligible phrase over and over. To gather empirical evidence, Daniel installed 3 security cameras. This diagram shows how he mapped their fields of view to cover the living room, the hallway, and the front door, ensuring that any movement would be caught on a digital record. During his first night of monitoring, the living room camera flickered for a single second at 2:14 a.m. When the image stabilized, the couch had shifted 3 inches. No person had entered the frame, and the motion left no auditory trace. Daniel rewound the footage repeatedly, but the transition was instantaneous. The movement occurred entirely within that 1-second glitch, leaving him with visual proof of a physical change with no visible cause. The camera data provided proof that he was dealing with an external agent. The couch had been moved by a physical force, confirming that an unknown mass was actively interacting with the interior of his home while he watched. He checked the front door feed and found a shape standing behind the glass panel. It was unnaturally tall and thin, unmoving, and entirely out of proportion with any human frame. The entity pressed a face against the glass. The features weren't human. They were a collection of parts stretching and shifting into place. Its eyes were too large, and its mouth opened in a way that defied the limits of bone and muscle. That night, the established pattern broke. The disturbances didn't wait for 2:14 a.m. At 1:03 a.m., the dragging sounds were replaced by heavy thuds against the walls, sounding like something was hitting the house from the inside. As Daniel retreated to his bedroom, his security network began to fail. Static lines cut through the feeds until only one remained, the hallway camera, pointed directly at his bedroom door. The feed captured a tall, thin figure with elongated arms standing at the end of the hall. Its head was tilted at an impossible angle, and its face was a blank expanse of smooth skin, lacking eyes, a nose, or a mouth. By abandoning its schedule and disabling the cameras, the entity moved past the phase of observation. It was no longer lingering at the perimeter. It had successfully moved into the center of Daniel's life. As the figure reached the door, hollow eyes and a gaping mouth began to push outward from beneath its skin. The features didn't form through growth, but through a physical emergence, as if the entity was forcing a human likeness onto its blank face. Then the laptop speakers crackled. In Daniel's own voice, perfectly matched in tone and inflection, the entity told him to open the door, before whispering that it was already inside the room. The power cut out, leaving only the glow of the screen. Standing directly behind Daniel was the entity, now a perfect physical duplicate of him. Every detail was correct, except for the eyes, which remained completely empty and dark. The entity smiled, mimicking Daniel's expression with unsettling accuracy. It had utilized its time in the house to study its subject and refine a template for a total replacement. The next morning, investigators found Daniel's house undisturbed. The locks were secure and there were no signs of a struggle. Daniel Reeves was gone, leaving behind a perfectly maintained home. The security footage shows Daniel walking out of his house at 2:14 a.m. He stops under the porch light and turns toward the camera, smiling with solid black eyes, before walking away into the darkness. Shortly after Daniel disappeared, reports of similar anomalies began coming in from the surrounding streets. Neighbors reported dragging sounds inside their walls, doors unlocking by themselves, and 2:14 a.m. glitches appearing on their own security feeds. The evidence suggests the phenomenon has spread beyond a single house on Cedar Lane. The 2:14 a.m. pattern is now repeating across the neighborhood, indicating that Daniel Reeves was simply the first subject in an expanding cycle of replacement.